Starting out, I would like to clarify something from last week. The picture and then the way that Hebrews put it threw me off, but the picture was correct, and the altar of incense was on the opposite side of the curtain from the Ark of the Covenant. Yeah, I want to get that straightened out. In Hebrews, it makes it sound the other way, but it doesn't actually say that it is the other way. What it does is it associates the altar of incense with the Ark of the Covenant. It says in verse 3 of chapter 9 of Hebrews, behind the second veil there was a tabernacle which is called the Holy of Holies, having a golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides with gold, and then he describes it. So those two things constitute the furniture items of the Holy of Holies, but they were on opposite sides of the curtain. The altar of incense was where you burned incense before God. But that curtain was still dividing them. And Zechariah in the Christmas story is one of those who went in to burn incense before the Lord. And that's something they did daily. But they would actually go into the Holy of Holies, as the author of Hebrews also points out, once a year on the Day of Atonement. The altar of incense was correct in the picture. It was in the most holy place, but really it was in the holy place, but part of the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, if that makes sense. So today we're going to be looking at the enemies of Israel, the other nations that they encountered and butted heads with very few, if any, exceptions, during their travels and during the time of the judges. Let's go to Exodus chapter 19. And whoever's there first can read it.
If anyone will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you shall speak to the sons of Israel.
So we talked a lot about the covenant that God made with Israel, both last week and the week before that. And a part of that was God's special relationship with Israel. They were to be his kingdom, a kingdom of priests. A priest being someone who goes between God and men. The Israelites were supposed to have that role for the world. They were God's representatives to the people of the world, in a very similar way to what we are, actually. Peter uses this same terminology of us. We are a priesthood, a holy nation for God. And God was to be their king, their recognized leader. So this is a bit after where we left them in the wilderness. After they left Mount Sinai, of course, they continued to the promised land, and they ended up in Kadesh Barnea, which is right down there. And the first time they came there, they sent spies up through the land of Israel and back, and they reported that the people living in the land were gigantic. They had fortified cities. There was no way the Israelites were equipped to fight them. And because the Israelites lacked faith, they refused to fight the Canaanites. God told them that they had to wait 40 years before going into the land, that they themselves would not see it, but their children would inherit it. And at the end of 40 years, Moses led them back to the promised land. He didn't cross the Jordan with them, but he brought them all the way there. And they, again, stayed for a while at Kadesh Barnea and followed pretty much the red line route. Let me make sure this is the map that I think it is. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so they go from, I wasn't seeing the alternate lines here. Sorry, it was almost a whole week ago that I put this together. There are a few alternate lines, different routes that they could have taken. The most likely route probably is the red one, the one you can see the best. But they went around a long way, out of their way, further than they had to, because Edom would not let them through their land. On their way, they tried to pass through Edom, but were denied passage. They sent a message to the king saying, we'll only travel by the highway. We won't eat anything. We won't stop. We'll just go straight through. Please let us through. And the way that passage is written is interesting. It doesn't say Moses and the Israelites said this, and then the Edomites and their king said this. It says Israel said this, and Edom said this, and it refers to them as he, and they call each other brother. So it's Jacob and Esau having a conversation in that passage, which is really interesting. And that's who the Edomites were. They were the descendants of Esau. And Israel, even with their brother nation, they said, we've suffered in Egypt. We've come out. We need to get to this land. We just need to pass through yours. And Edom responded with hostility. They actually began assembling an army and coming against the Israelites. And so the Israelites said, okay, never mind, we'll go around. And did not fight them. So they went the long way around Edom, and then they tried to go through the land of the Amorites. And again, they asked for permission to go through the Amorites' land. But the king of the Amorites, Sihon, came out against them with an army. And this time they actually did fight and defeated the Amorites. And this was the first bit of conquest, the first bit of success that they had in conquering the promised land. The cities that they won from Sihon, king of the Amorites, they actually lived in. They settled in those cities and began to live at least very close to the place where they were going. And from there, it kind of became a base of operations for them, and they stayed there for a while. They sent their military, not their whole people, but just their fighting men up north, made a military excursion up this dotted line, and encountered Og, the king of Bashan, who they also defeated. So everywhere they went, initially they had this great success. And of course, it continued as they actually went in under Joshua and began conquering the Canaanites themselves. But the king of Moab became very worried about all this. So here's Edom, here's Moab right here. And it's the plains of Moab, north of Moab, where the Israelites are camped, where they're staying. Now, the Moabites and the Amorites. Okay, so I just talked about the Amorites. This is confusing. It's easy to get them mixed up, especially if you read the book, the book of Judges later. There are some parts where you really have to focus on the words or you'll get confused. But the Amorites are the ones they defeated. The Ammonites were a smaller group of people that don't really come into this account here, but become a little more important now and then later. Never as important as Moab. But the Moabites and Ammonites were the descendants of Lot's two children that he had with his daughters, yes. So they were both cousins and brothers. And the guy who the Ammonites came from and the guy the Moabites came from. So they were also related to Israel. And God told Israel, they are not for you to take over. Mm-hmm. Yeah, God told them, don't take over the land of Moab or Ammon or Edom. They are your brothers. I have not given you their land. But these nations, as I've already indicated, were hostile to Israel. They did not believe, they did not trust Israel's intentions in regard to them. They simply saw Israel defeating nations around them and got worried. Balak, the king of Moab, got very afraid of the Israelites camping near him, decided that he was going to be next. And so he called for a prophet named Balaam to come and curse the Israelites. And you remember the story, but sometimes we tell it without fitting it into its historical context about Balaam coming on his donkey to King Balak with the intention of cursing Israel, and then God preventing him, the donkey speaking eventually and telling Balaam, why are you beating me when I stop, when I run away? There's an angel in the middle of the road. He's going to kill you. And Balaam sees the angel. He sees the sword, realizes the donkey saved his life. And with that added incentive of fear, knowing that God could cut him down with an invisible sword at any time, he obeys God, says only the words God tells him to say, and does not curse the Israelites, but blesses them instead. And that's where that particular account ends. And there's a good chance that we have that story from the perspective of Balaam himself. And that's why it doesn't really say anything too negative about Balaam. But when we read the whole story, we see that that wasn't the last thing Balaam did. He gave Balak advice on how to defeat the Israelites. And it was very cunning advice, very solid advice that worked very well. It was incredibly wicked, but Balak, right after Balaam left, changed his tactics. And we know from the book of Revelation, actually, I think we'll get there on the next slide. Yeah, if somebody wants to go look that up. Where who? Yeah. He had a prophetic gift that was recognized. People knew those he blessed were blessed, those he cursed were cursed. And he seemed to like we've been talking about, the knowledge of God, the worship of Yahweh himself was preserved in different cultures. And Balaam wasn't a great person morally at all, but he had some understanding of God. God talked to him in dreams, gave him instructions. He was a legitimate prophet. He spoke the words of God. But he was a terrible person at the same time, which, yeah. Does someone have Revelation chapter 2?
I have two things against you, because you have the someone who teaches the Balaam. Kept teaching the Balaam, because someone brought before the sons of Israel to eat things sacrificed to idols and commit acts of immorality. So you also have someone who, in the same way, have held the teachings of the disciples. However,
Yeah. That first part's the part I'm looking at. The fact that Balaam is the one who gave Balak this advice, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block in front of the children of Israel. Because what Moab did immediately after Balaam left was they used the Midianites. They didn't, and the Moabites to some extent, those that were in the land that the Israelites had just conquered. Okay, because the Israelites had just conquered the Amorites, the one with the R in it, and that was territory that used to belong to Moab. So there were Moabites living there. And the Moabites who were there, on Balak's instructions, approached the Israelites and invited them to their religious feasts and to participate in their worship. Okay? And their worship involved sexual immorality. They sent the women to invite the men to these feasts, okay? So using that tactic, Balak was able to get a lot of the Israelite men specifically to turn to idolatry and arouse the wrath of God. Balaam knew that the strength of the Moabites would be nothing if they tried to attack Israel. He believed in the power of God, and he used the power of God against the Israelites. Balaam had a sick mind, but it worked. God judged the Israelites. Many of them died. Actually, yeah, it says the number in there. I have it on the last slide, but it was 2,000 something, right? It won't let me go backward for some reason. But anyway, oh, it's because I'm recording. That's why. But yeah, the anxiety of Balak was completely unfounded because his land was not part of the land that the Israelites were commanded to take. They were not hostile toward him. And the whole thing was unnecessary. And in a later battle, Balaam himself was killed by the Israelites when they attacked the Midianites, actually. The Moabites, I keep starting to say things and then not finishing. Sorry, guys. The Midianites were used by the Moabites together with their own women. The Midianites were the more numerous of the two in this plot. And it was the Midianites that the Israelites retaliated against. God told them, attack the Midianites and slay them because they have done this. So the Midianites, if you remember, were the people that Moses fled to when he fled from Egypt. So Zipporah, Moses' wife, was a Midianite. And the Midianites were also descended from Abraham. From like all of these people in this part of the world are related. They were some of the sons. Yeah, just like that. They were. Midian was a son of Abraham's second wife, Keturah, or third wife, I suppose, if you want to get technical and include Hagar in there. But yeah, Abraham was the father of many nations in a very literal sense. So the Israelites went into the land, they fought, they tried, they succeeded, they failed some as well. A lot of their failing was simply a refusal to fight. They saw that certain countries had iron chariots, and if their technology was better, if their cities were strong, they very often made the assumption, okay, we can't take them, we're not even going to try. A few times they were defeated for sin reasons, like in AI and stuff like that. But the green area, there's some debate on whether all of Aram up there was part of the original deal, but that was basically the area they were supposed to conquer. The pink is the area they actually did. So not, it's good, but it isn't great, especially when you consider they were landlocked for most of their history. They didn't get to the sea. Like the cities of Tyre and Sidon up there, big port cities, Israel should have had those, and they didn't. The Philistines, of course, were a thorn in Israel's side for ages, and then the Canaanites that actually lived among them as well. But these were other nations that Israel dealt with throughout their history. The Arameans, actually, in the service last Sunday, and again this Sunday, they're important. Aram is the country that makes an allegiance with the northern kingdom of Israel against Judah in the south. So that's where Aram is. It's up north of Israel, and the capital of Aram is Damascus. And then on the seacoast up there, you have Phoenicia, which is where Tyre and Sidon are. That's where Jezebel came from. And then down along the coast, of course, you have Philistia. And the Philistines, there may have been different groups of people at different times who came from different places who were called Philistines just because they lived in that area. But the Philistines we're most familiar with probably came across the sea. They were sea people from Crete or somewhere like that. And the name Palestine comes from Philistine, because that was their land. That name was eventually applied by the Romans to the whole area. Let's go over to Judges chapter 2 and read a little bit of a longer section. The book of Judges is basically summed up in this passage right here. Judges 2, starting in verse 1, says this: Then the angel of Yahweh came up from Gilgal to Bochim. This is right after the author of Judges has described the Israelites failing to take all of the land because of fear, because of unbelief. They allowed many of the Canaanites to remain and did not defeat them. The angel of Yahweh came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall cut no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not listened to my voice. What is this you have done? Therefore, I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods will become a snare to you. So it happened that when the angel of Yahweh spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to Yahweh. Then Joshua sent the people away, and the sons of Israel went each to his inheritance to possess the land. And the people served Yahweh all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who saw all the great work of Yahweh which he had done for Israel. Then Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of Yahweh, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them, who did not know Yahweh, or even the work which he had done for Israel. And there's a failure, obviously, to teach. We know that Joshua himself made an effort to teach those who came after him to serve the Lord. And I don't know that this is entirely, I don't know that they didn't know the Lord entirely because the information didn't get passed down. But what they got from their fathers was not an example of faith in God. They did fail to conquer the land. They failed to accomplish the work that God had given them to do. And part of that failure was the failure to train their children properly. But it's important that both of those things be present when we teach our children, that we give them the word of God and then we show them that word in action, that there not be a disconnect between what they learn from us and what they see in us. And however much of either of those may have been involved, that generation did not know Yahweh or the work which he had done for Israel. And the sons of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh and served the Baals. Verse 12. And they forsook Yahweh, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked Yahweh to anger. So they forsook Yahweh and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. And the anger of Yahweh burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of Yahweh was against them for evil, as Yahweh had spoken, and as Yahweh had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed. And some of the nations that we see in Judges that came against them are nations that we've already talked about. For example, Gideon fought mainly the Midianites, right? Jephthah fought the Ammonites, not the Amorites, the Ammonites. He got into an argument with them. The Ammonites claimed that the Israelites had stolen their land. They wanted the land where Israel lived here. They lived in Ammon, the green part, but they wanted the land of Gilead, which was part of Israel. The Ammonites, yes. So the brother of Moab, those people. But Jephthah sends a letter back clarifying the history, saying, we defeated the Amorites here. This land did not belong to you. Our God gave it to us. Don't you keep whatever lands your God gives to you. We'll keep this land. Thank you very much. So those are the Ammonites in that story. Samson, of course, fought the Philistines. And it may be largely due to Samson stirring up the Philistines against Israel that we get some of the wars and troubles in the days of Eli, Saul, and David later. But Yahweh in verse 16 raised up judges who saved the Israelites from the hands of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges either, for they played the harlot after other gods and bowed themselves down to them. They turned after other gods. Already read that. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked, in obeying the commandments of Yahweh. They did not do as their fathers had done. Now when Yahweh raised up judges for them, Yahweh was with the judge and saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For Yahweh was moved to pity by their groaning, because of those who oppressed and suppressed them. But it happened when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers, in following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. So this map can get you through a lot of Old Testament history. Actually, you see on this map, Israel and Judah are already divided. That happened later in the days of Rehoboam. But basically, this was the set of nations right around Israel that they had to deal with. Aram, Phoenicia, Philistia, Edom, Moab, Ammon. So when those names come up in the Bible, that's where they are. Maps are wonderful. Maps help so much if you have a Bible with maps in the back. But it is really amazing all the parallels that exist between the history of Israel as a nation and the history of individual Christians. Sometimes they were saved, were rescued, were redeemed in the way that they were out of Egypt. The Red Sea pictures baptism, Paul says. They were baptized into Moses the way that we're baptized into Christ. They were given instruction on how to live. Even the covenants that God makes with them, there are conditional and unconditional aspects of our relationship with God as well. For the Israelites, some things were unconditional. That was their land. And someday in the future, they would have it forever and have it perfectly, and God would be with them forever. That was the promise. And in the meantime, they got a taste of that But there were always problems, and those problems were caused by their own sin, not by God's lack of faithfulness. Because there was that conditional, temporary covenant where if they obeyed God, they would experience his blessing. And when they didn't, they would be out of fellowship with him. He would make them feel his absence in order to bring them back to him. And it is so much the way that God deals with us. He brings things into our lives when we drift away from him to remind us of him, to bring us back. But so often, just like in their history, especially near the beginning of our Christian lives, it's a temporary repentance. And the things that we used to serve still have so much of a hold on us that we constantly turn back to them. And let's end with 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And let's start at the beginning of the chapter, actually. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were struck down in the wilderness. Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things, as they also craved. Be not idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and stood up to play. Nor let us act in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell on one day. That's the incident with Balaam with the Moabites. 23,000 fell because of that. Nor let us put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have arrived. And that's another reason why we study the history of Israel. It is preserved for this reason, to help us understand the holiness of God and live lives that please him. Therefore, in verse 12, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Any questions or comments about anything that we went over today, or anything really that we've done so far? Because usually we end right at the second bell and don't have time. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, I know Abraham is chosen by God, but Sarah must have been chosen by God as well, because all of other Abraham's children, God gave nations to, and he doesn't care for Sarah's child that he cares for.
Well, it was Sarah's child who was a miracle. He was the child of the promise. When God gave the promise to Abraham that he would have a child that all nations would be blessed through, it was Isaac that was the one. So even though Abraham did have multiple children, God says it is through Isaac that your seed will be reckoned. Keturah was legitimate as well. But yeah, Isaac was the special subject of that promise. And in a way, with the sacrifice, you could say that. He's Abraham's only begotten son. Yes, is what he's called in the New Testament. He's your only son, the son you love, is what God calls him, even though he wasn't technically his only son. But in God's eyes, yeah. And in the story of Isaac being offered, you could say the main picture of Christ is the ram, right? Not Isaac himself, but the substitute. And that's the second bell. So you are all dismissed, and I will see you in church.